Search her purse, Daniel said, his voice calm enough to sound reasonable, but sharp enough to slice through the quiet clink of crystal and silverware. The spoon didn't just disappear. I didn't move, not at first, not when every head at that long mahogany table slowly turned toward me, not when my daughter Emily stopped mid-sip and set her wine glass down with a soft, careful click as if sudden movements might make things worse, and certainly not when the woman across from me pulled her handbag closer to her side, as though theft were something that could spread by proximity. I simply folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and looked at the empty space where the silver dessert spoon had been just moments ago, a small polished thing that had reflected the chandelier light so brightly it almost looked like a star, and I thought about how strange it was that something so small could shift the entire atmosphere of a room that had, only minutes earlier, been filled with polite laughter and the low murmur of wealth pretending to be warmth. Daniel leaned back in his chair, one arm draped over it like he owned not just the house but the air inside it, his cufflinks catching the light as he gestured lightly toward me again, not raising his voice, never needing to. "It's not a big deal," he added, though his tone suggested the opposite. "We just need to be sure." And there it was, the performance of civility wrapped around an accusation that hung heavier than anything I had carried into that house. I had spent the afternoon choosing my dress, a soft gray one my late husband used to say made me look elegant without trying too hard. Had taken extra time brushing my silver hair until it lay just right on my shoulders, had even brought a small gift for Emily, a set of linen napkins I'd found at a shop downtown, thinking it might be something she'd actually use, something that would make me feel, for a brief moment, like I still belonged in her life beyond holidays and formal invitations. And now I sat there being measured not by those quiet efforts, but by the absence of a spoon. No one spoke, not immediately, because silence, I've learned, is often the first language of discomfort, and in that silence I could hear everything: the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the almost imperceptible shift of chairs as people adjusted themselves away from me without making it obvious. And I realized then that this wasn't really about silverware. It was about position, about power, about who in that room could be questioned and who could not. Emily finally looked at me, her expression tight, uncertain, caught somewhere between daughter and wife, and I saw the hesitation there, the calculation, the way she chose not to speak when speaking would have been the simplest form of loyalty, and that told me more than any accusation ever could. I placed my hands calmly in my lap, fingers resting lightly against each other, and met Daniel's gaze without flinching, not because I needed to defend myself, but because I understood something he didn't, something that had been building quietly beneath all the polite dinners and carefully worded conversations, something that made this moment feel less like a surprise and more like a confirmation. He thought this was the moment I would break, that I would rush to prove my innocence, that I would fumble through my purse with trembling hands just to restore the fragile balance of his evening. But I didn't reach for my bag, I didn't argue, I didn't even ask why, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of expectations is nothing at all. And as I sat there, still and composed, I noticed something else, something small but important: the way the butler, James, who had been standing quietly near the sideboard all evening, had shifted his weight ever so slightly, his eyes not on me, but on Daniel, and in that subtle shift, in that quiet redirection of attention, I felt the first hint that the story unfolding at that table wasn't going to end the way Daniel expected. I let the silence stretch just a second longer than what felt comfortable for everyone else, long enough for the weight of the accusation to settle into the room and make people shift in their seats, long enough for Daniel to believe he was in control of the moment, because people like him often mistake silence for weakness when in reality it is simply patience. I reached for my glass of water instead of my purse, taking a small steady sip, the kind that buys time without appearing to need it, and set it back down with the same quiet care I had used all evening, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened, and that seemed to unsettle him more than any protest could have, because he leaned forward slightly, his smile tightening at the corners as though he had expected a different kind of reaction, something messier, something easier to dismiss. "Margaret," he said, softer now but no less pointed, "we just want to clear this up." And I noticed the word "we," how quickly he wrapped the room around himself, how easily people allowed it, and I wondered when exactly that had started, when my daughter's home had become a place where I needed to be cleared of anything at all. Emily glanced between us, her fingers twisting the stem of her glass in a way she used to do when she was a child caught between telling the truth and avoiding trouble, and for a moment I almost spoke, almost gave her the relief of hearing me deny it, but something stopped me, something that had been growing quietly over the past year, through small comments and subtle exclusions, through invitations that arrived later and later or not at all, through the careful way Daniel always framed things as reasonable while making sure I understood exactly where I stood. I remembered the first time he had corrected me in front of others, smiling as he did it, explaining a detail about finances I already knew as if I were forgetful. The way people had laughed lightly, not unkindly, but enough to mark a shift, enough to make me feel just slightly out of place in a room that once would have felt like home. And I realized now that tonight was not an isolated moment but a continuation, a step further along a path he had been laying down piece by piece. The guests remained quiet, but their eyes spoke volumes, some curious, some uncomfortable, a few almost sympathetic but not enough to intervene. Because in rooms like this, people protect their comfort above all else, and comfort rarely aligns with confrontation. Daniel tapped the table lightly with his fingers, a subtle impatience creeping in, and then he gestured again, this time more directly. If you could just open your bag, we can all move on. And there it was again, that tone of efficiency, as though I were the only obstacle between him and the smooth continuation of his evening, as though dignity were a minor inconvenience that could be set aside for the sake of convenience. I looked at my purse where it rested beside my chair, untouched, ordinary, holding nothing more than the usual things a woman my age carries, and I thought about how easily appearances can be manipulated, how quickly a narrative can form when someone with enough confidence presents it as fact. And I realized that if I reached for it now, if I complied without question, I would be confirming something far more significant than the presence or absence of a spoon. I would be confirming his right to question me in the first place. So I did not move, not yet, and instead I let my gaze travel slowly across the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn, not accusing, not pleading, simply present. And one by one, people looked away because being seen is often more uncomfortable than seeing. And when my eyes finally returned to Daniel, I noticed something I had not seen before, a flicker of uncertainty, small but real, like a hairline crack in a surface that had seemed perfectly polished moments earlier. Behind him, near the sideboard, James stood as he always had, composed, unobtrusive, but now I could see the tension in his posture, the slight straightening of his shoulders, the way his attention remained fixed not on me but on Daniel's jacket draped casually over the back of his chair. And that detail settled into my mind with quiet clarity, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of the instinct that had kept me still. Daniel followed my gaze for just a fraction of a second before catching himself, his hand moving almost imperceptibly toward the chair as if to adjust it, and then stopping, and in that brief, almost invisible hesitation, everything shifted, not in the room, not yet, but inside me, where the uncertainty I might have felt was replaced by something steadier, something far more certain. Because I understood now that this moment was not about proving my innocence, it was about allowing the truth to reveal itself in its own time, and as the silence deepened once more, no longer empty, but charged, I folded my hands again and waited. No one moved to help him, and that was the first thing that changed the balance in the room, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone could point to and name, but in the subtle way conversations fail to restart and laughter does not return. In the way the air itself seemed to grow heavier as Daniel waited for someone to support him and found only silence instead. I could see it in the tightening of his jaw, in the way his fingers pressed a little too firmly against the edge of the table, a man accustomed to agreement now forced to stand alone in a moment he had orchestrated too carefully to abandon, and yet not carefully enough to control. Emily finally cleared her throat, a small fragile sound that seemed to belong to another version of her, one that existed before polished dinners and measured words. Maybe we should just, she began, but her voice faded before it found a direction, because even she did not know which side of this moment she was meant to stand on, and that hesitation, more than anything else, told me how far things had shifted between us. I did not look at her again, not because I was angry, but because I understood that whatever decision she made now would not come from instinct, but from influence, and influence had been working quietly in this house for a long time. Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing a light chuckle that did not quite reach his eyes. "It is just a misunderstanding," he said, as though he were the one smoothing things over, as though he were offering me a graceful way out of something I had not done. And then he leaned forward again, lowering his voice just enough to suggest reason. "Margaret, please, just open your bag so we can move on." And there it was again, that insistence, that careful framing of compliance as cooperation, of obedience as resolution. I tilted my head slightly, not in defiance but in quiet consideration, as if I were weighing his request on its own merit rather than on the foundation it rested upon, and in doing so I allowed the moment to stretch once more, because time has a way of revealing what pressure alone cannot. Somewhere behind me a chair shifted, someone adjusting their position, perhaps hoping the situation would resolve itself without requiring their involvement, because discomfort is something most people prefer to observe rather than interrupt. I finally reached for my purse, not with urgency, not with the nervousness he had expected, but with the same deliberate calm I had maintained all evening, and I placed it gently on the table in front of me, the soft leather making a quiet sound against the polished surface, and for a moment I rested my hand on it without opening it, letting the room focus entirely on that single object, letting anticipation build, not because I owed anyone proof, but because they had already decided there must be something to find. Daniel leaned in slightly, his attention fixed, his confidence returning now that he believed the moment was bending back into his control, and I could almost see the conclusion forming in his mind, the quiet satisfaction of being proven right in front of an audience that had already begun to accept his version of events. But just as my fingers touched the clasp, I paused again, not long, just enough to redirect the rhythm of the moment, and then instead of opening it, I looked past him directly at James, who had not moved from his position near the sideboard, whose posture remained composed but whose eyes had sharpened in a way that suggested awareness rather than observation. "James," I said gently, my voice steady, neither loud nor hesitant, simply present in a room that had grown accustomed to Daniel's tone, and the effect was immediate, subtle but undeniable, because it shifted the focus away from me and toward someone who had, until now, been part of the background. Daniel turned slightly, a flicker of irritation crossing his face at the interruption, but James had already stepped forward, his movements precise, measured, the kind of professionalism that comes from years of knowing when to remain invisible and when to be seen. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice calm, respectful, but carrying just enough weight to hold the attention of the entire table. And I saw it then, the moment Daniel realized that the control he thought he held was not as secure as he had believed, the way his shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly, the way his hand moved again toward the back of his chair, toward the jacket draped there, and stopped. And in that hesitation, in that almost invisible break in his composure, the truth began to take shape, not through accusation, not through defense, but through the quiet alignment of details that could no longer be ignored. And I withdrew my hand from my purse, leaving it closed, untouched, because I no longer needed to open it at all. James did not rush, and that alone drew every eye toward him, because in a room that had been pushed into tension, his calm felt deliberate rather than passive, like someone who understood the weight of timing and chose not to waste it. He stepped forward just enough to be seen clearly without intruding, his hands loosely clasped in front of him, posture straight, voice measured. When he finally spoke, "Sir," he said, addressing Daniel with the same formal respect he had shown all evening, but there was something different beneath it now, something firmer, something that suggested he was no longer simply serving the dinner. "Before we continue, there may be something you should be aware of." And the phrasing alone shifted the tone, because it did not accuse, it did not defend, it simply introduced the possibility that Daniel did not hold the full picture. Daniel's expression tightened, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face as he glanced around the table, perhaps expecting someone to interrupt, to restore the order he had established, but no one did, and that silence once again worked against him. "This is not necessary," Daniel replied, his voice controlled but sharper now. "We are simply resolving a small issue," and the word small felt almost out of place after the tension he had created, as if he were trying to shrink the moment now that it no longer belonged entirely to him. James inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without yielding to it. "Of course, sir," he said. "However, I believe accuracy is important." And there it was, that quiet insistence, not loud, not confrontational, but impossible to ignore, because it appealed not to emotion, but to something more difficult to argue against. I remained still, my hands resting lightly in my lap, watching not as a participant in the accusation, but as an observer of its unraveling, because the shift had already begun and all that remained was for it to complete itself. Emily looked between Daniel and James, her confusion deepening, her earlier hesitation now turning into something closer to unease, as if she were beginning to sense that the narrative she had been standing beside was not as solid as it appeared. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly, her voice breaking the silence just enough to give James the opening he had not forced but patiently waited for. James turned his attention to her briefly, his tone softening in acknowledgement. "Earlier this evening," he said, "while clearing the dessert settings, I noticed that one of the spoons had been set aside temporarily." He paused, not for effect but to ensure clarity. "It was not removed from the table by any guest." And that statement settled into the room like a quiet ripple, subtle but undeniable. Daniel shifted in his chair, his hand once again brushing against the back where his jacket hung, this time more noticeably, though he quickly withdrew it, as if the movement itself might draw attention. "Then where is it?" he asked, a hint of impatience. Returning, but now it sounded different, less certain, less controlled. James's gaze did not waver. "It was placed with your personal items, sir," he said, and though his tone remained respectful, the meaning landed with unmistakable clarity. For a moment no one reacted because the mind often needs a second to adjust when a story changes direction so suddenly, and in that brief pause I saw it, the exact moment Daniel understood that the ground beneath him had shifted. Not dramatically, not with noise or confrontation, but with something far more difficult to counter, quiet precision. Emily turned toward him slowly, her expression no longer uncertain but searching, as if she were trying to reconcile the man she knew with the situation unfolding in front of her. "Daniel," she said, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there before, not doubt exactly, but the beginning of it. He forced a small laugh, too quick, too sharp. "That is not possible," he replied. But the confidence that had defined him earlier had begun to fracture, subtle but visible in the way he did not quite meet anyone's eyes. James remained composed. "If you would like, sir, I can retrieve it," he offered, not as a challenge but as a solution, and in doing so, he removed any space Daniel might have had to redirect the situation. The room held its breath, not in anticipation of conflict, but in recognition that the truth once introduced does not need to be raised, it simply needs to be allowed to stand, and as I watched, still and silent, I realized that everything Daniel had built in that moment, the control, the narrative, the quiet authority, was not being torn down, but rather slipping away on its own, undone not by force, but by the simple presence of what was always there. Daniel did not answer immediately, and that hesitation carried more weight than any denial he could have offered, because silence, when it comes from someone who has been speaking with certainty, does not feel composed, it feels exposed. He shifted in his chair again, this time more noticeably, his hand finally reaching for the back where his jacket hung, fingers brushing the fabric as though he were simply adjusting it, but the movement was too deliberate, too late, and everyone at the table saw it even if they did not say so. "There must be some confusion," he said, his voice returning to that measured tone he relied on, but it no longer filled the room the same way, it no longer carried the quiet authority it had just moments ago. "I would never." He stopped, the sentence unfinished, because finishing it would have required conviction he no longer possessed. James did not interrupt, did not push. He simply waited, and that patience made the moment heavier, because it removed any sense of urgency that Daniel might have used to regain control, leaving only the expectation of truth. Emily's gaze moved slowly from James to Daniel, then to the jacket and back again, her expression tightening not with anger, but with realization, the kind that does not arrive all at once but settles in piece by piece, making each second feel longer than the last. "Daniel," she said again, softer this time but firmer, and there was something different in her voice now, something that no longer asked for reassurance but expected clarity. He let out a short breath, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it, and finally reached for the jacket, lifting it from the chair with a casualness that did not quite match the tension in his shoulders. "Fine," he said, as though he were humoring an unnecessary exercise, "if it will put this to rest." And he slipped his hand into the inside pocket, a gesture so routine it should have meant nothing, and yet every eye followed it. Every breath in the room seemed to pause in quiet anticipation. For a fraction of a second nothing happened, his hand still inside the pocket, his expression frozen between expectation and something else, something less certain, and then he withdrew it, and there it was, the small silver spoon catching the chandelier light just as it had earlier. But now its reflection felt different, not bright, not harmless but sharp, undeniable. No one spoke because there are moments when words feel unnecessary, when the truth stands so clearly on its own that anything added to it would only diminish its weight. And this was one of those moments. Daniel stared at the spoon as though it did not belong to him, as though it had appeared there without his knowledge, and perhaps in his mind it had, because acknowledging how it got there would mean acknowledging everything that had led to this moment. Emily's face changed slowly, not dramatically, not with sudden anger or shock, but with a quiet shift that spoke of something deeper, something harder to repair, the kind of realization that does not raise its voice but alters the way you see someone forever. "How did that get there?" she asked, and the question hung in the air, not as an accusation, but as a demand for truth that could no longer be redirected. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, his usual ease replaced by a careful search for an explanation that would not come, because there are situations where the more you try to explain, the more obvious the reality becomes. "I must have," he began, but the words faltered, and for the first time that evening, he looked uncertain in a way that could not be hidden behind politeness or confidence. I remained where I was, my purse still closed in front of me, untouched, because I no longer needed to open it, no longer needed to prove anything. The moment had moved beyond that, beyond accusation and defense, into something quieter and far more revealing. James inclined his head slightly, not in triumph, not in judgment, but in simple acknowledgement of what had been shown, and then stepped back, returning to his place as though his role in the evening had been fulfilled, though the effect of his words remained. Around the table people shifted again, but this time the movement was different, not away from me, but away from Daniel, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to change the shape of the room, enough to show where the balance now rested. I looked at him then, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm that came from understanding, and I saw in his expression the realization that this had never been about a spoon. Not really. It had been about control, about testing boundaries, about seeing how far he could push before someone pushed back. And now he knew the answer, not because I had argued, not because I had defended myself, but because I had allowed the truth to surface without interference, and in doing so I had taken back something he thought he could quietly take away. No one reached for their glass this time. No one attempted to restart the conversation or soften the moment with polite laughter, because something had shifted too deeply for that, something that could not be undone with a casual remark or a change of topic. And in that stillness, Daniel remained seated with the spoon in his hand, as though he had not yet decided what to do with it, or perhaps as though he understood that no action would restore what had just been lost. He finally placed it back on the table, carefully, almost deliberately, but the gesture carried none of the control it once might have. It felt like surrender dressed as composure, and when he looked up again, his eyes did not settle easily on anyone, not on Emily, not on me, not even on the guests who now avoided his gaze in the same quiet way they had avoided mine earlier. "This is being blown out of proportion," he said. His voice steadier now, but thinner, like something stretched too far. It was an honest mistake. And the words hung there, insufficient, because an honest mistake does not begin with an accusation. It does not require a public display. It does not need witnesses. Emily's posture changed beside him, not abruptly, but enough to be noticed, her shoulders no longer angled toward him in quiet alignment, but slightly away, her hands now resting still on the table instead of fidgeting, and when she spoke, her voice did not waver the way it had before. "You asked them to search her," she said, not loudly, not harshly, just clearly, and the simplicity of that sentence cut through everything else, because it stripped away the framing, the careful language, the attempt to minimize, and left only the truth of what had happened. Daniel turned toward her, his expression tightening. "I was trying to resolve the situation," he replied, but even as he spoke it sounded less like explanation and more like defense, and that difference, small as it might seem, was enough to shift the ground beneath him further. I watched them without interruption, not because I was detached, but because I understood that this part of the moment did not belong to me. It belonged to the space between them, to the realization that was forming in Emily's mind, not from anything I had said, but from what she had seen. Around the table, the guests began to move again, quietly, cautiously, as though testing whether it was acceptable to re-engage with the evening, but their movements were different now, more restrained, more aware, because the illusion of effortless harmony had been broken, and once broken, it cannot be fully restored. One of them cleared their throat, another adjusted their napkin, small gestures that signaled a desire to return to normal, even if normal no longer existed in the same way. James had resumed his position near the sideboard, his presence once again unobtrusive but not invisible, because now everyone knew he had seen more than he had said, and that knowledge lingered in the room like a quiet truth no one would challenge. Daniel leaned back slightly, attempting to reclaim some of his earlier composure, But the posture did not hold, it lacked the ease it once had, and for the first time, he looked not like someone in control, but like someone aware of being observed. I placed my hands on the table and slowly stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, simply rising in a way that drew attention without demanding it, and the movement alone was enough to quiet the room again, because departure, when done without haste, carries its own kind of authority. Emily looked up at me immediately, her expression shifting from tension to something closer to concern, but she did not speak, perhaps because she did not yet know what to say, or perhaps because she understood that words in this moment would not repair what had been exposed. I adjusted my dress lightly, smoothing the fabric as I had done earlier that evening before leaving my home, the same small gesture, but now it carried a different meaning, not preparation but closure. "Thank you for dinner," I said, my voice calm, even not directed at anyone in particular, but heard by all. And in that sentence there was no accusation, no bitterness, no need to revisit what had already been revealed, because dignity does not require repetition. Daniel opened his mouth as if to respond, perhaps to offer an apology, perhaps to regain footing, but whatever words he had did not arrive in time, and I did not wait for them, because some moments are not meant to be extended, they are meant to be left exactly where they stand. As I turned toward the hallway, I felt the weight of the room behind me, not heavy in the way it had been earlier, but altered, quieter, more aware, and with each step, I understood that what I was leaving was not just a dinner, but a version of myself that had once accepted things without question, that had remained silent out of habit rather than choice, and now, without raising my voice, without opening my purse, without defending myself at all, I had changed something far more important than the outcome of an accusation. I had changed the way I would be seen, and more importantly, the way I would allow myself to remain. The hallway felt quieter than it should have, as though the house itself were holding its breath, and for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to slow down, not because I was unsure, but because there was no longer any need to rush through a moment that had already revealed everything it needed to. The soft carpet muted my steps as I moved past framed photographs that once felt familiar, images of holidays, birthdays, carefully staged smiles that now seemed less like memories and more like performances I had once believed without question, and I realized how easily I had accepted small shifts over time, how I had explained away the subtle changes in tone, the delayed invitations, the quiet decisions made without me until those small things had gathered into something undeniable. Behind me, I could still hear faint movement from the dining room, chairs adjusting, voices low and uncertain, but no one followed immediately, and that, too, said something, because if there had been urgency, if there had been genuine concern, someone would have come after me right away, but instead, they remained where they were, sorting through what had just happened, deciding how to respond, and in doing so, they confirmed that the moment at the table had not been an accident, it had been a pattern finally brought into the light. I reached the front entry and paused for a brief second, my hand resting lightly on the edge of the console table where I had placed my coat earlier, and I noticed how neatly everything had been arranged, the same careful attention to presentation that defined the dinner, the same effort to make everything appear controlled and refined, and I thought about how much energy had been spent maintaining that image and how little it had taken to fracture it. I picked up my coat and slipped it on slowly, smoothing the fabric over my shoulders, the motion steady, familiar, grounding, and as I did, I heard footsteps approaching from behind, quicker this time, more certain, and I knew before I turned who it would be. "Mom." Emily's voice reached me, softer now, stripped of the careful composure she had held at the table, and I turned to face her, not with expectation, not with accusation, but simply present, allowing her the space to say whatever she had come to say. She stopped a few feet away, her expression no longer guarded but searching, as if she were trying to find the version of me she had known before everything shifted, and for a moment she said nothing, her breath catching slightly as though she were choosing her words carefully. "I did not know," she said finally, and the sentence was simple, almost fragile, but it carried the weight of something she had not been ready to admit before. I held her gaze, not questioning, not confirming, just listening, because what mattered now was not whether she had known, but what she understood in this moment. "He said it was just a misunderstanding," she continued, her voice quieter, less certain. "I thought," and she stopped again, the rest of the thought dissolving before it could form, because whatever she had believed earlier no longer fit the reality she had just witnessed. I nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, because sometimes the most honest response is simply to accept what has been said without adding to it. "You did not ask," I I replied gently, my voice steady, not harsh, not accusing, just clear, and the words settled between us with a quiet finality, because they were not about the spoon, not about the dinner, but about something much larger, something that had been missing long before this evening began. Emily looked down for a moment, her shoulders drawing in slightly, not defensively, but in recognition, and when she looked back up, there was something different in her eyes, not just concern but awareness, the beginning of a shift that could not be undone. I should have, she said, and there was no excuse in her tone, no attempt to soften the truth, just a simple admission that carried more weight than any explanation. I reached for the door, my hand resting on the handle for a brief second before I turned it, feeling the cool air from outside slip in as the door opened, and I paused once more, not because I was hesitant, but because I understood that this moment, quiet as it was, marked a change that would extend far beyond this house, far beyond this night. I looked back at her, taking in the expression on her face, the uncertainty, the realization, the quiet beginning of something that might in time become understanding, and I gave her a small measured nod, not of forgiveness, not yet, but of recognition, because growth does not begin with resolution, it begins with clarity, and as I stepped out into the night, leaving the warmth of the house behind me, I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by what had been taken from me, but by what I had chosen to no longer give away. The night air felt cooler than I expected, carrying that quiet stillness that only comes after something has ended but not yet been replaced. And as I stepped onto the driveway, I paused for just a moment, not out of hesitation, but to take in the shift, the subtle but undeniable difference between who I had been when I arrived and who I was now as I stood beneath the soft glow of the porch light. The house behind me remained bright, every window lit, every room still holding the echoes of a carefully arranged evening that had unraveled without noise, and I wondered briefly how long it would take for them to settle back into conversation, how they would explain what had happened, whether they would minimize it, reshape it, or simply avoid it altogether, because people often choose comfort over truth when given the chance. I walked slowly toward my car, the gravel beneath my shoes making a faint, steady sound that felt grounding in its simplicity, a contrast to the polished quiet of the dining room, and as I reached for the handle, I noticed my reflection in the window, not clearly, just enough to see the outline of myself, the posture, the stillness, and there was something different there. Not stronger in any visible way but steadier, as if something that had once been uncertain had finally settled into place. I opened the door and sat inside, closing it gently behind me, and for a moment I did not start the engine. I simply rested my hands on the steering wheel and allowed the silence to expand, not empty, but full of the kind of clarity that only comes after everything unnecessary has fallen away. Inside that house, I had been asked to prove something that did not belong to me. And in choosing not to respond the way they expected, I had seen more clearly than ever how little that accusation had to do with a missing object and how much it had to do with position, with control, with the quiet testing of boundaries that had been happening long before tonight. I thought about the small moments that had led here, the comments disguised as jokes, the decisions made without including me, the way Daniel had learned to guide conversations just enough to shape perception without ever appearing direct, and I understood now that those moments had not been isolated. They had been part of a pattern, one that relied on silence to continue, on my willingness to overlook, to adjust, to remain in place even as that place shifted beneath me. I exhaled slowly, the tension leaving not all at once, but in layers like something unwinding rather than breaking, and I realized that what I felt was not anger, not even disappointment, but something quieter, something more final, the recognition that I no longer needed to interpret or excuse what had already revealed itself so clearly. A car passed at the end of the street, its headlights briefly illuminating the front of the house before disappearing again, and in that brief light, I saw movement at the front door, a shadow, then the door opening slightly, and I knew without looking closely that it was Emily, standing there, not stepping out, not calling after me, just watching as though she were trying to understand a distance that had not existed before. I did not wave, not because I was indifferent, but because some moments do not require gestures, they require space. And space is not something that can be given halfway. I started the engine, the quiet hum filling the car, and adjusted the mirror without really needing to, a simple action to steady myself before moving forward. And as I backed out of the driveway, I allowed myself one last glance at the house, not to hold on to it, but to acknowledge it for what it was, a place that had once felt like an extension of my life, and now stood separate, not because it had changed suddenly, but because I had finally seen it clearly. The road ahead was empty, stretching out under the dim streetlights, and as I drove, the events of the evening did not replay in sharp detail. They settled instead into something quieter, something understood rather than relived. And with each mile, I felt less like I was leaving something behind and more like I was stepping into something I had postponed for too long. A life defined not by where I was included, but by where I chose to stand. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my eyes forward, and for the first time in a long while, there was no need to prepare for the next conversation, no need to anticipate the next subtle shift, because whatever came next would not be shaped by someone else's expectations, but by my own decisions, and that, more than anything that had happened at that table, felt like the true beginning of something new. By the time I reached the main road, the house had already faded into the distance, not dramatically, not in a way that marked a clear ending, but gradually, like something losing its hold without resistance. And I realized that what I was leaving behind was not just a place or an evening, but a version of myself that had remained patient long after patience had stopped being understood as strength and had begun to be mistaken for permission. The streetlights passed one by one above me, each casting a brief circle of light before giving way to the next, and in that steady rhythm, my thoughts settled into something quieter, more ordered, not scattered by emotion, but aligned with a clarity I had not allowed myself before. I thought about Daniel, about the way he had constructed his authority piece by piece, never raising his voice, never making a move that could be easily challenged, always operating within the boundaries of what could be explained away. And I understood now that his mistake had not been the accusation itself, but the assumption that I would respond the way I always had, that I would protect the comfort of the room even at my own expense, that I would accept the role he had quietly assigned to me without ever naming it. I turned onto a quieter street, the houses spaced farther apart, their lights dimmer, more private, and I felt the distance deepen, not just physically but internally, as if each mile placed a clearer line between what had been and what would no longer continue. Emily's face came to mind, not as it had been at the table, uncertain and divided, but as it had been at the door, searching, unsettled, and I recognized that her understanding had only just begun, that whatever came next for her would unfold slowly, shaped not by what I might say, but by what she had already seen and could no longer unsee. I did not feel the need to call her, not tonight, not to explain or to guide, because there are moments when explanation becomes a way of softening truth, and I had no intention of softening what had finally revealed itself so clearly. The car moved steadily beneath me, the engine quiet, the road open, and for the first time in a long while, there was no anticipation of the next adjustment, no mental preparation for the next conversation where I might need to measure my words or overlook a slight in order to maintain balance, because that balance had never truly been shared, it had been maintained by me alone. I slowed as I approached a red light, the empty intersection stretching out in all directions, and I stopped, not impatiently but fully present, allowing the stillness to exist without needing to fill it. And in that pause, I understood something that had been forming throughout the evening, something that had become undeniable the moment I chose not to open my purse. That dignity is not something granted by others, it is something defined by what you refuse to accept. The light changed and I moved forward again, the motion simple, unforced, and as I drove, I considered what would come next, not in terms of confrontation or resolution, but in terms of distance, of boundaries that would no longer be implied but quietly established, not through declarations but through absence, through the decisions I would make about where I chose to be, and where I no longer needed to remain. The house I had left would continue, its routines intact, its conversations reshaped, its version of events adjusted to fit whatever narrative felt most comfortable. But I would not be part of that adjustment, I would not return to that table carrying the same expectations, because expectations, I had learned, are often the very things that allow patterns to continue. As I turned into my own street, the familiarity of it settled around me, not as a return, but as a continuation of something steadier, something that had been there all along, waiting for me to recognize it. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, the quiet settling once more. But this time it felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, but complete. And as I sat there for a moment before stepping out, I realized that nothing about the evening needed to be revisited or re-examined, because its meaning had already settled into place, not as a wound but as a boundary, and in that understanding there was no need for closure. Only the quiet certainty that I would never again allow myself to be positioned in a space where my presence required justification, because I had already stepped out of it, and I had no intention of stepping back.